And it is our pleasure to welcome back to the show our buddy Chase Hughes from Monumental Sports. You read him on their website. You see him on your television. There's so many places to get Chase Hughes content. And one more is right here on this radio show. What's up, Chase?
Not much, man. It's great to be back on with you.
Always great to have you. So we were talking about Deni Avdija in the last segment, and there is a lot of obviously Deni Avdija ceiling talk these days because of the 43-point game that he had right before the All-Star break, and he had a really, really good 2-week stretch before the break. As you talk to folks around the team and kind of watch with your own eyes the development of Deni this year, like where do you see him as a player right now, and how much more room to grow is there through your eyes with him?
Well, I see a guy who's made a pretty big leap this year. Obviously scoring more points, doing more in a volume sense than he has the first 3 years of his career, but also just becoming a more reliable three-point shooter and a better rebounder. He's become one of the best rebounders on the team. And I asked interim coach Brian Keefe about him yesterday, just his offensive versatility. And he said that he thinks a lot of it just starts with getting defensive rebounds and taking the ball up the court. So I think the big reason why a lot of things have been unlocked for him this year is that the Wizards are playing faster. They've been up near the top of the league in pace all year. And it just really suits Deni's strengths because he's really good in transition. He's big, he can handle the ball, he's fast, and he's starting to recognize when he can take advantage of physical mismatches, especially in open space. So as far as his ceiling, I think it's probably being raised in a lot of people's eyes. And I think moving forward, especially if the Wizards are playing this style, then I think he could be at a minimum, a rotation player, probably a starter on a good team. Like when the Wizards are ready to contend for the playoffs, I think he could be a key contributor on that type of team.
So you and I think, are very much on the same page here, which is we say many nice things and then we land on he's a rotation player, like a very good one potentially, but this is not someone that I see as a future superstar, and yet there's a very loud portion of Wizards Twitter and the Wizards fan base that I think gets carried away with the 2 weeks and the 43 points. And I would be quick to point out, by the way, that the 5 points he had in the one game post All-Star break before getting hurt, that's not who he is either. He's just somewhere in between. So like if we think about realistically what that rotation player looks like, that kind of finished version, as much as any NBA player ever is, of Deni Avdija, like what does that look like statistically in your mind?
Well, if he ends up becoming a starter on a playoff team or like a really good team, then that's nothing to sneeze at. I mean, you
right.
mentioned being a superstar. There's only a handful of those guys in the league. It's really, really hard to become that good. But for Deni, I mean, I think obviously being a scoring threat in transition, now he can make threes. I think that the key will be having the same impact that he does in transition in the court. They've run him off a lot more pick and rolls this year, a lot more frequently than we saw the first 3 years. And, he's got to, continue to get better at tightening his handle and protecting the ball. But he's on the right track. And, he's a good rebounder, as I mentioned. We haven't really talked about his defense, but anyone who's watched him over the last few years knows that, he's a very versatile and gifted defender. I think the more help the Wizards can get for him and guys like Bilal Coulibaly, that, they're better defenders, the more help they can get on that end of the floor, the more it'll simplify things for a guy like Deni. And, he won't be left on an island against some of the best players in the league. He'll have, help in terms of help defense and also rim protectors behind him. But I think a two-way player who can rebound and can be uniquely good in transition and a starter on a playoff team, if he ends up being that, then he'll be well worth the 9th overall pick.
Without a doubt, and I think he's also the kind of guy that can win you a playoff game. Like I think of, the best example is unfortunately terribly heartbreaking for the Wizards because I think of the Kelly Olynyk game. And I think of how, back in 2016, that dude was a role player, won a playoff game for the Celtics and wound up winning them a series. I think Deni Avdija with his skill set could absolutely be that kind of guy that wins you a playoff game. I don't say single-handedly, but with an outsized type of impact. And I think that's a super valuable piece to have. You mentioned Brian Keefe. What have you made of how are some of the changes, big macro size changes that the Wizards have made since Keefe took over, outside of Jordan Poole, who we'll talk about separately in a moment?
Yeah, I'll start on the offensive end. I know he's talked a lot about defense, but one discernible difference has definitely been the amount of threes that the Wizards are attempting. Coming out of the All-Star break, they'd been like seventh in the league in total threes attempted over the previous month since Keith had taken over. And, they took 40 last night, and they're not necessarily shooting like that efficiently. Like during this stretch, they've had a couple games where they've shot sub 30% from three, but they're making a lot of threes. In the 4 games leading up to the All-Star break, they tied a franchise record making 23s, and then a couple games later, they set a new record making 21. So that's been one difference. Defensively, they've kind of regressed lately, but for the most part, they've been better. And, when you ask the players what's been different, they say that they're trusting each other a lot more in isolation defense. They're not doing as much help defense. And I think it's simplified things where you're not having as much miscommunication on switches. So that's been different. And then in general, you hear from players all the time that Brian Keefe is like very direct, very blunt when it comes to holding people accountable. And we've noticed that a little bit, like in the media, like sometimes, he'll kind of give it back to us a little bit. He's just kind of a no-nonsense guy. Like he's not going to sugarcoat it. He's going to tell you what he thinks. And as Johnny Davis told us last night, sometimes it'll be in front of the entire group. Well, he'll be like, you're not doing this well enough. You got to be better at it. And I think that's the type of accountability the Wizards are searching for right now.
Chase Hughes, of course, Monumental Sports, with us here on the Hoffman Show. So before we get to Poole, and that's how we'll wrap up our chat here, I'm going to ask you the biggest macro size question I can. So big, Chase, that as we stream on YouTube, this is the question that's on the graphic. Are the Wizards showing improvement despite the fact that they have lost 11 games in a row? Because the vibes are good, the results are bad. Trying to make sense of that. Are the Wizards improving despite the results of the last 11 games?
I think they are because the young guys have taken steps forward this year. I think whatever they end up with, however many wins at the end of the season, if the progress continues for Deni Avdija and Corey Kispert, you're going to feel good about that. Bilal Coulibaly has, obviously dealt with what all rookies deal with, which is just the tonnage of games. Like you get to a point where I think all these young guys just get tired as they're adjusting to playing an 82-game season. So, call it the rookie wall, call it whatever you want. Right now, obviously, he's hurt. As long as he continues to have a successful rookie season, you'll feel good about that. So I think those are the things that the Wizards will hang their hat on at the end of the year. Now, over these last 25 games, if they can get back to playing the defense they were kind of leading up to the All-Star break, where over about a month, going back to January 9th, up until the All-Star break, they were a top 10 defense. I think they'll feel a lot better about that. They made progress last night against Cleveland, but, going up against Oklahoma City and Denver and giving up 130 plus, that's certainly not what they're looking for.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And they had, until those recent blowouts, been pretty competitive during this streak in a way that they hadn't been previously under Wes Unseld, which obviously, as much as we all love Wes, was the reason why he ultimately is no longer the head coach of the team. All right, then there is Jordan Poole, who is obviously an important part of this rebuild to try to recoup his value, if you will, after a miserable start to his Wizards career. He wasn't particularly thrilled, it seemed, about being moved to the bench, but he has responded by having great performances offensively, including a season-high 31 last night against Cleveland in the loss. Like, what have you made of Jordan Poole's post All-Star resurgence here? Is it the break? Is it the role? Like, what are the factors here?
I think the role has a lot to do with it. He was in good spirits last night. It was like the first time that we really saw a breakthrough from this new role. Like the first 2 games, he scored a decent amount of points, but it wasn't exactly efficient. And last night, it really kind of peaked in the fourth quarter. He had 11 points in the first 3 minutes, made 3 threes, and was really kind of feeling it and kind of interacting with the crowd. 2 things on the role. I think one, it helps any player to go to the second unit and then all of a sudden be facing backups. Like it's a completely different dynamic when you're going up against second units compared to starters. But perhaps more importantly, he gets to play more on the ball than he had previously this season. And I didn't really realize just how much he'd been playing off the ball, or at least as a shooting guard, until I looked at the position estimate that Basketball Reference has, which isn't an exact science, but they had him as a shooting guard 83% of the time this year leading up to the All-Star break. And that was by far the most that he's played as a shooting guard in his career. Like, looking back at his time in Golden State, he was actually a starter more often than he was coming off the bench. But he played a lot of point guard in Golden State, way more than I thought he did. And they ran a lot of pick and rolls with him last year. It was something like over 400 pick and rolls, which is a lot. Like, it was more than like Bradley Beal and Monte Morris did combined last season. And,
Wow.
Two guys who ran a lot of them for the Wizards. So they're going to run a lot of pick and rolls with him. He's the point guard. Johnny Davis, as of now, is the shooting guard in that second unit. He's only focused on defense. So it's really kind of like up to Jordan Poole to get going offensively. And I thought we saw a step forward last night. And he talked about it after the game about how he's playing much more on the ball than he had earlier this season. So I think he's adapting to that role, and we'll see the positives in it over time.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's the thing that I think blew my mind earlier this year, Chase, is I just kept looking at the field goal attempts and being like, this is not enough. Like, this dude's got to shoot more. And I don't know whether it's putting the ball in his hands, it's whether it's taking him or giving him more minutes where Kyle is not on the floor, because obviously Kyle's got high usage. It's not a criticism. It's just like, he's the best player on the team. He should have high usage, but that means less possessions available for other guys. So when he's on the bench, if all of a sudden JP's the guy, then he's going to get the ball more. And to me, that's the most encouraging thing. The results are great, but the fact that he's actually shooting again makes it feel like, oh yeah, like I recognize that guy. That's Jordan Poole.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about putting him on the bench as opposed to the starting lineup. Tyus Jones also has to get his shots, and when you put Jordan Poole at the 2 combined with Tyus, and it's a little undersized as a backcourt, and also when Jordan Poole is the 2, he doesn't really have a physical advantage over many of the guys guarding him at that spot. But if you put him at the 1, he's 6'4", he's fast. He can find some mismatches at that spot, even though point guards are obviously bigger now than they've ever been. And I just like the idea of having Johnny Davis out there, too, just to focus on defense. It's like you don't really have to share the ball as often with, a guy like Tyus Jones. He can just kind of go run the offense, and they surround him with shooters. The Wizards have a lot of shooters in their second unit, of course, highlighted by Corey Kispert. So it does make sense. Like, the reasoning makes sense, but, of course, it's up to Jordan Poole to figure it out on his own.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, you working on any? I always like to ask you this because you write some crazy cool stories sometimes. Anything in particular you're working on right now?
Yeah, so I'm working on a story on Corey Kispert's pregame shooting routine,
Ooh.
Like specifically where he shoots from, how many shots he takes, and talking to other players about it. So I filmed his whole pregame shooting routine last night, and I got to go through it and chart it by the numbers. But I talked to him and got some ins and outs of it. I think it's going to be a pretty cool story.
That is awesome. That is good stuff. I'm excited to read that.
Appreciate it.
Chase Hughes, always writing interesting stuff on Monumental Sports website. And then, of course, an active participant in their pre- and post-game shows, halftime as well. Sometimes even joining the game broadcast. He's a versatile man. Chase, always appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely, man. Thanks. Anytime.
All right, that is Chase Hughes from Monumental Sports. Quick look at what's trending, and then we'll react to some of the Jordan Poole stuff to close out the hour next on The Hoffman Show.
This is The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.